Also remember that toe is your primary tire wear. A parallelogram steering system is more complicated than a rack and pinion. It's not really that complicated. It's not any more complicated. They're just saying that just to scare you. It has a pitman arm, an idler arm, a center link, a tie rod end, and adjustment sleeve. It has, I need to change it. All right, now rubber bellows the rubber bellows protects the inner joints from dirt and contamination. No, we're going to change that right now because that is part of this one. Aha, there we go. Save. All right, rubber bellows is the bellows that protects the inner joints from dirt and contaminants. In addition, it retains the grease lubricant inside the rack and pinion housing. There are two ends of the rack. Each side contains identical bellows.
Simpler, since the rack itself is part of the linkage. Movement of the steering wheel is transferred through the steering column, intermediate shaft, and universal joints to rotate the pinion, which moves the rack from side to side. A tie rod with a ball swivel at each end of the rack relays the movement directly to the steering lever on each wheel assembly. The rack can thus be considered as the center track rod of a three-piece track rod system. The steering lever, or steering arm, is linked to the tie rod, or track rod, by a flexible ball joint that allows for suspension movement and steering rotation. The lever, the stub axle, and the stub axle carrier can be forged as one piece. They can be referred to as a knuckle. They can also be made as separate units and assembled to form one piece. Each steering system makes provision for adjustment of the linkage to achieve the manufacturer's recommended toe setting. The track rods or tie rod ends are threaded to provide for their lengthening or shortening.
The parallelogram steering system is used on larger vehicles where ride comfort is more important than sporty handling. Parallelogram steering linkage is more complicated than a rack and pinion linkage, so there are more wear points to know about and inspect. The primary components of the parallelogram steering system from the gearbox on are pitman arm, idler arm, center link, tie rod end, and an adjustment sleeve. A pitman arm transfers the movement from the steering box to the center link. It is attached to the steering box by a spline and nut. Splines are ridges of teeth on the drive shaft that mesh with the grooves in the mating piece that transfer torque, and it maintains the angular correspondence between the components. As the driver turns the steering wheel, the steering box mechanism moves the steering linkages via the pitman arm either left or right, depending on the direction in which the steering wheel is turned. The steering box provides the change of angle at 90 degrees to the steering linkage and also provides steering ratio to assist the ease of turning to the steering wheel and linkages. An idler arm is attached to the chassis, which is the frame of the car, and is positioned parallel to the pitman arm. The idler arm assembly is the pivoting support for the steering linkage. It consists of a rod that pivots and a bracket bolted on the frame of the vehicle on one end and supports a ball socket on the other end. Generally, an idler arm is attached between the opposite side of the center link from the pitman arm and a vehicle's frame to hold the center link at the proper height so it can accurately relay the pitman's arm's movements. The idler arms are generally more vulnerable to wear than the pitman arms because the pivot functioning built into them. The center link connects the pitman arm to the idler arm. In this way, any movement in the pitman arm is directly applied to the idler arm. So why is this called the center link? Right here? Anybody know why this is called the center link?
The center connect both?
Huh?
Because it's in the center and connect both sides?
It's in the center. Just remember that. The center link is called the center link because it's in the middle, right there in the center. Center. You guys got it?
Multitasking dude over there, man.
Yeah, he's multitasking over there, right? Doing his CDX homework and chapter 38.
No, sir, baby.
All right. Do what you gotta do. Alright, tie rod ends are attached to the tie rod shaft. They pivot and the rack is extended or retracted when the vehicle is negotiating turns. Tie rods and tie rod ends are left or right hand threaded. The inner tie rod ends are attached to either end of the center link and serve as a pivot points for the steering gear. So even in the rack and pinion system, an inner and outer tie rod, they function the same. They may look different, but they function the same.
Being that they are left and right hand threaded, or could be, does it mean you have to be extra careful when you're replacing these parts?
No, the left hand and right hand threaded is letting you know that when you're adjusting the toe on this, you either got to go left to tighten, or right to tighten, or right to loose, or right to loose, depending on the side you're in. Does that make sense?
Yes, but is there like an indication of
There is no indication.
so you gotta do
Right. A lot of times the right hand, if you're doing an alignment, on the right hand side, it's, if you're under the vehicle and you're facing it, so it actually left is loose, right? Left is loose. On the left hand side, right is loose.
Just a little lever to keep in mind.
Yep. All right, the adjustment sleeve connects the tie rod to the tie rod end and provides the adjustment point for the toe in and toe out depending on the manufacturer's specs. It is considered a turnbuckle, usually with one end having a left hand threads and the other one again having right hand threads. When turning the sleeve, the tie rods thread apart or together to set the vehicle toe. Then you have a tie rod on each side of the vehicle connects each wheel assembly to a center leg. Each connection point in the linkage system has a pivoting point, which is a ball and socket construction. Ball and socket construction are ball joints, the flexible joints on the center link and in the ends of the tie rods that allow for steering and suspension movements. The tie rods have a ball sockets that allow steering movement and movement on the suspension system. The tie rod and swivel joints are at equal heights and pivot so that the movement in the suspension does not affect the steering operation. On the four-wheel drive vehicles with beam axles, they have a single tie rod connecting the steering arms on each wheel assembly. So if you look in this picture right here, it's completely different from a parallelogram, right? So this bar right here is connected both the sides of the left and right toe. So if you're changing your toe setting, this giant bar you would need to turn with a big wrench or a big pair of pliers, pretty much, or a pipe wrench to turn this to set the toe. This is your right here is where your steering adjustment is. I forgot what that's called. What is that? It changes and it controls the position of your steering wheel. So when you are aligning the vehicle, you always set your toe first. All right, you got to set your total toe. It's not a toe on left and not a toe on right. It's called a total toe, and then you would change your steering angle. Your steering angle, that's what that is, right? And you also have a dampener right here. It looks like a little shot. The steering box is offset from the steering column, so two universal joints and intermediate steering shaft are used. Four-wheel drive vehicles of this type often use a steering dampener on a single tie rod. It resembles a shock absorber and operates on a similar principle. Specifically, it keeps the steering wheel from shaking when the driver hits a pothole or other road irregularity.
The steering linkage is a combination of rods and arms that transmit the movement of the steering gear to the front wheels. It must transmit this movement to the front wheels while still allowing for any up and down movement they may make while the vehicle is in motion. The type of steering mechanism and the number of linkages depends on the type of steering box, its location, and the type of suspension on the vehicle. Passenger cars with independent suspension and using a worm-type steering box may have the steering box mounted so that the linkage is in front or behind the suspension crossmember. When the linkage is behind, it is protected by the crossmember from possible damage, and the position of the steering box reduces the length of the steering column. Steering wheel movement is relayed through the steering gear and pitman arm to a center track rod. The center track rod is connected to the pitman arm at one end and to a steering idler arm at the other end. The idler arm assembly is bolted to the vehicle frame, and the idler arm is positioned parallel to the pitman arm. It can then relay the steering box movement accurately to the opposite side. A tie rod on each side of the vehicle connects each wheel assembly with the center track rod. Flexible joints on the track rod and on the ends of the tie rods allow for steering and suspension movement.
All right, all done. Let's take a 15-minute break. We're going to go take a look at what a parallelogram actually looks like in a vehicle. And then we're working on Boone's car.